Hello and welcome to today's video. So this time we're going to be sitting down with Kelsy Norman. Now Kelsy runs an amazing podcast called The Speeding Bullet, the life and work of Steve McQueen. And this podcast analyzes Steve's career, well, from his very earliest days, and it's currently about halfway through his career. It's just fantastic. The detail is amazing. It makes you want to go back and watch the Steve McQueen movies again and again. And I just absolutely love it, and I'm so delighted that we were able to grab a quick half hour together to talk about the show, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it as well. So sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Kelsy, thank you very much for joining us today. I've been a huge fan of your podcast pretty much since it started. I think I may have joined about episode 4 or 5 when you'd had a friend of mine, Paul Bishop, on talking about Wanted Dead or Alive. He put it on his Men's Adventure sort of paperback group on Facebook. I thought, wow, a podcast devoted to Steve McQueen. That's right up my alley. I've got to check that one out. And since then, I've been absolutely hooked. So I have to ask, first of all, what sort of got you interested in the life of Steve McQueen, and how did that lead to you creating your podcast?
Well, I appreciate you checking it out and taking an interest in it and sticking with the show. We're going to have to hop in the Bullitt Mustang. We're going to put it in reverse. We're going to take it all the way back to 1997. I know that doesn't seem too long ago, but it was 24 years ago. And that is the first time that I can remember seeing a Steve McQueen film. I grew up on the east coast of Canada in New Brunswick. My parents were divorced. I didn't live with my father. But once I graduated high school, I went out to Vancouver Island, the opposite end of the country. And I was living with my father, and this was a time where you could still rent VHS movies. There was no Netflix, there was no streaming services, and him and I were at a movie rental place, and I said, listen, I want a good movie to watch tonight. I want something that I've never seen before, and I want something that's really going to suck me in. And so he said, well, you got to see this movie, and he pointed to The Great Escape. I looked at the cover. I said, this looks like it could be pretty good. So took it home, put it in the VCR, and the moment McQueen came on the screen, I was like, who's this guy? Who is this person right here? Because he just captivates you. He sucks you in. You can't take your eyes off him. Something about him. He's just oozing cool, right? And
absolutely.
That was my first introduction to Steve McQueen. There's a slim chance I might have seen The Blob when I was a kid, but I don't remember that. There's a good chance that I would have seen it. So it was The Great Escape, and at that time I was 18 years old. And so as I got into my early 20s and started to figure out who I was, the more I would go into Steve McQueen's filmography. And eventually I started collecting the DVDs, trying to collect whatever I could get of his that was available to me. And it just, something about him at that time of my life, as a person, young man, trying to figure out, I'd always been kind of, I don't want to say a loner in using that as a pejorative, but kind of a loner, trying to do my own thing, figuring things out. And I think that aspect of the McQueen persona really registered with me. And as I watched more of his films, read more about him, obviously reading the Marshall Terrill books, I just really started to take a liking to him. And I think it was probably around 2010, I would go online and I would look. There's got to be a Steve McQueen podcast. This guy's an icon. Somebody must have created a podcast about Steve McQueen. And I would check about every 6 months and no podcast. Eventually, I just got sick of there being no podcast for Steve McQueen. So I thought, well, if no one else is going to do it, I'll do it myself. And that's where the idea for Speeding Bullet, the life and films of Steve McQueen came from. And about doing it for about a year and a half now, and it's been an awesome learning experience.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of why I started my YouTube channel, was because I've just started doing the videos that I would like to watch myself, because there's no one really doing old paperbacks on YouTube. And that's brilliant. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly are you about halfway in the journey, or just under halfway, do you think?
I'm not too sure. We look at his, I think we have about 12 movies left to look at of his, but I also want to do a deeper dive on Wanted Dead or Alive. And
brilliant. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that was 3 seasons, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And Absolutely, yeah. Wanted Dead or Alive is well, after hearing the episode that Paul came on talking about the show, I've obviously didn't know anything about it prior to it, really. And I'm at an age where I can vaguely remember the westerns having a bit of a revival in like the very late 70s, early 80s. But I'd never seen Wanted Dead or Alive, but quite easy to get hold of nowadays. And yeah, I've become hooked. And they're quite a nice, easy one to watch. If it's maybe late at night, I'll pop one on my phone. But I do end up, because it's black and white, they just send me to sleep sometimes.
Yeah.
But I do love it. You mentioned Marshall Terrell. Well, yeah, what he is, I mean, he is a Steve McQueen expert. I
He
mean,
is.
and he's so good that you've hooked up with him, because he can come on and give all that information about a particular show or any sort of aspect. I mean, do you think, is there any aspect of Steve's life that that Marshall Terrell doesn't know? I mean, he seems to know everything. Having spent all those years studying him, I guess.
Before I get into that, I do have to say a couple things about Marshall.
Mm.
He is the Steve McQueen expert. He has studied, researched, written about, unearthed stories about the King of Cool for the last 30 years. Nobody has done the amount of research and work that he has done on Steve McQueen. When you're reading another Steve McQueen book, that person probably got a large chunk of their research from a Marshall Terrell book. Although this is Speeding Bullitt is my podcast, I am the person who created it and hosts it and produce it. It would not be possible without Marshall Terrell, the Steve McQueen expert, because he was the first person I reached out to for the podcast. He instantaneously said, yes, I will do. I think maybe at the time he thought it was only going to be that one episode. Well, it turns out he's probably been on about 20 of the episodes, and I can't do this show without him. He's extremely nice, generous, kind, knowledgeable person. In terms of, is there anything he doesn't know? There was an episode of the show, and I can't remember which, but he was talking about the basketball player Pete Maravich, and he had interviewed Pete Maravich's father, who was also a basketball coach. And what he said, I believe this is what he said, was that Pete Maravich's father put a dot on a basketball, and he said that dot on the basketball represents everything I know about basketball. Well, the basketball represents everything there is to know about basketball. And Marshall said, this is kind of how I feel about Steve McQueen. Yes, I know a lot, but when you're talking about a man who lived 50 years and we know he kept himself busy, there is a lot to know about Steve McQueen. So although Marshall is the Steve McQueen expert, he probably knows the most about Steve McQueen. There's still a lot out there for him to unearth and discover. Now, yes, Marshall Terrell is the Steve McQueen expert. There's another gentleman as well, Matt Stone, who I have to mention, who has written, I believe, 3 books about Steve McQueen, but what he focuses on are Steve McQueen's bikes, Steve McQueen's cars, and then he also recently wrote a book about the movie Bullitt and the Bullitt Mustangs. So Marshall is the expert. Matt Stone, I would say, he's pretty close to being the expert when it comes to McQueen's vehicles. So I have to give a shout out to Matt Stone as well.
For sure, yeah. I mean, boy, did he get through some cars and bikes, didn't he?
yes, he did.
And everyone is just drop dead gorgeous.
Yes,
absolutely. So many lovely cars.
Absolutely, but no, Marshall's been. What you hear on the podcast with me and Marshall is what we talk about that relates to Steve McQueen, but Marshall and I could easily release a bonus episode every 2 weeks of what we talk about before and after the formal questions. And Marshall's a reader. He reads everything, and he's highly knowledgeable in many different areas. The reason why he's so good at what he does, I think, is because, yes, he has studied everything about Steve McQueen, but what he will also do is he will read the books and he will read articles about people who were connected to McQueen, other actors, just in case that person mentions McQueen or mentions an interaction with McQueen. So you're really getting this all-encompassing story. Marshall wants to tell the whole story, or as much of the story as he can tell, and he's a reader. He reads a lot. And us as McQueen fans, we are the ones who benefit from Marshall's great work, his research, everything he's put into it for the last 30 years. So thank you, Marshall. Thanks for doing that.
Absolutely. I mean, they definitely bring another dynamic to it. I mean, apart from Marshall, you do also have loads of interesting guests come on. As I mentioned earlier, Paul Bishop covering, the Western side, which is his sort of area of expertise. I mean, how do you find these guests and then make contact with them and get them to come on to talk about their particular specialty?
Well, let's use Paul as an example. So Paul was maybe the third or fourth person that I ended up interviewing for the podcast. I knew I wanted to do an episode on Wanted Dead or Alive. So I went online and I just searched Western experts, Western literature, Western pop culture. And I got to a gentleman, and I can't remember what his name was, and I reached out and I said, hey, is this something you would be interested in talking to me about? Steve McQueen's Wanted Dead or Alive. And he said, no, not me. However, I know this guy. And it was Paul Bishop. And so he had put me in contact with Paul. Paul's excellent. I mean, anything to do pop culture, Western, whether it's films, literature, he is the guy. He really is. He's a fascinating person. He was a detective, LAPD for many, many years. He's just a fascinating person. So for someone like that, it's reaching out to someone, and that someone isn't the person, but they know the person. So,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a search. It's just an online search. Who can I find? And then sometimes Marshall will say, hey, you should talk to this person. Or another guest would say, hey, you should talk to this person. I mean, it's happened quite often where I will try to connect with someone and they'll say, I'm not the person, but I can tell you who the person is that you should be talking to. And in terms of trying to just come up with ideas, I don't want to tell the same stories that everybody else is telling about these films. So I will look at the film and say, what is it about this film that is interesting to me? Or what is it about this film that made it unique or stand out at that time? So I'll try to find that little aspect or try to find that little piece that isn't always obvious, and I will go and look for that person who can talk about that thing.
Brilliant. Yeah, but certainly Paul, our paths crossed a few years back for the first time because he'd through one of the Facebook groups, he'd ended up inheriting or being gifted a massive paperback collection. I mean, it was thousands and thousands of books, more than he could really handle. And it was a guy who was a New York taxi driver, and the collection had ended up in his sister's garage. And she said, look, I'm just going to have to get rid of this stuff. It's just enormous. But there was like big series of Western books, like 50, 60 in the set, and they'd be every single one in order, all bought from brand new and immaculately preserved. It just had this guy's little taxi stamp inside.
Yeah.
And he was just gifted all of these. So what he did, he basically said, look, I'm going to give all this stuff away to other collectors for free. He didn't want to make any money on it, even though it was worth thousands of pounds, probably. All he had to do was cover the postage to get it sent around the world.
Nice.
And he wrote it up in a really good sort of blog about how the collection came about and how it got given away. And he photographed everything. It was like 2 carloads of books. And I sort of covered that paperback find. I called it like the greatest paperback find of 2019 because it really was. I mean, it was phenomenal. I had a really, really good one myself last year, so I think I got my revenge. But yeah, and that's how we sort of met. Really, I sort of brought his blog piece to life, and yeah. So, but boy, oh boy, yeah, he's the guy for Westerns.
He's another guy who just loves to read. You follow him on Twitter, and he's a funny guy. He says a lot of he types out a lot of funny jokes, and he's talking about reading. Also, I have to say this about the podcast: it's never hard to get a guest. When you're talking about Steve McQueen, there's no more convincing. You just say, "Hey, I have the Steve McQueen podcast," and they often say, "Yeah, no problem. I'd love to do it." Steve McQueen is such a draw, and so many people want to talk about him, and it's a variety of different types of people who want to talk about him. I had a chance to interview a very well-known film professor, Janine Basinger, who's she taught Michael Bay in university.
Right.
Joss Whedon. She has this roster of these who's who of Hollywood type of students who took her film program. I mean, this woman she's like, hey, when I told my husband you were interviewing me about Steve McQueen, I just lit up, and he knew how excited I was. And this is an 80-year-old woman
Yeah,
who,
I remember that episode. It
yeah,
was really good.
teaches
Yeah,
film at
boy, oh boy.
university, and you'd think she'd be some sort of cinephile film snob, and she's like, oh no, I love Steve McQueen, and I'm so excited to talk to you about Steve McQueen. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, that is brilliant.
Hmm.
So, as I said just prior to starting, I'm up to where you've covered the Cincinnati Kid, but I wondered how or if you've actually planned all the episodes. So, The Great Escape, for example, in the end had 3 episodes devoted to
Mm,
that iconic film. Have you sort of, even roughly sort of thought, well, when I reach Bullitt, that's one of his major films.
mm,
That's going to be maybe 5 episodes
yeah,
devoted around Bullitt.
yeah.
Have you got that sort of penciled out yet, or just roughly even?
Yeah, I try to map it out. I'm flexible with it, though. I'm adaptable. So I'll map it out and kind of say, okay, a film like, well, we just did the Sand Pebbles, and
Yeah,
I've released 2 episodes for the Sand Pebbles so far, with a third episode coming up for the Sand Pebbles. And then we'll take a little break and we'll look at other aspects of Steve McQueen's life. And then we'll jump back into the films with the Thomas Crown Affair coming up. And I'll do 3 or 4 episodes
and
for
then
the
Bullitt.
yeah, for Thomas Crown Affair, and then for Bullitt. I mean, that's the crown jewel, right? I mean, that's the big
I
one.
reckon.
So
Yeah,
at probably about 5 or 6 episodes. Probably take us about 2 months, because two episodes a month. So it'll probably take us about 3 months to get through Bullitt, but nobody's gonna complain,
no,
right? I mean,
no,
I
no,
could
no.
do 8 episodes, and people wouldn't complain about spending so much time on that film. So I do map it out. But I'm, like I said, I'm flexible. So if something comes up, or Marshall says, "Hey, we should do an episode that looks at this," or something enters my head or my mind, I mean,
Mm,
there's a lot of McQueen stuff coming out all the time, and I want to be flexible. So
yeah,
there was recently a McQueen documentary that came out that looked at the lost Steve McQueen film, Day of the Champion.
indeed.
It
Yeah,
was released over there in the UK,
that's
and
right. I've got it sort of recorded, but I haven't
yeah.
watched it yet.
Yeah, and so when that was released, I mean, that's something I couldn't prepare for, but it popped up, and reached out to
Yeah,
the director, and I had a chance to interview him. And so I
absolutely.
map
Yeah.
things out, and then I also, I'm flexible with where the show goes.
Well, that's good. I guess that's all you can be, and
Yeah.
there will be little things that, like you say, they'll come out the blue, and
Hmm.
we need to do an episode on this now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, even though potentially you're like almost halfway through Steve's career,
Yeah.
there's even more than that. You could easily double the length of the podcast already. Maybe go for another 2, even 3 years potentially. You never know.
Like I said early, I'd like to do a deeper dive into Wanted Dead or Alive.
Yeah,
He has some
which would be great.
he has some
Yeah.
TV movie. Well, he had a TV movie called The Defenders with William Shatner
Yeah.
in that one from the 50s. I'd like to do an episode on that as well, and just other aspects of his life. So 34 episodes in. I think I got 12 movies left. But again, if you say because these are some big movies coming up. I mean, these are the
Yeah,
Thomas Crown
absolutely.
Affair. This is Bullitt, The Towering Inferno, The Getaway. There's some really big McQueen movies coming up in his filmography, and so again, 2 or 3 episodes for those movies. I think when it's all said and done, I could see the podcast being 65 to 80 episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. I sort of savor them, and I watch them as they go along. So
I
I'm
like
only
hearing
about
that.
7 behind at the moment, but yeah, it's really it's almost like, well, the days of a DVD commentary, isn't it? It's similar to that, I
Yeah,
think.
absolutely, Jules. Listen, what I'll say is that they are evergreen. They're not
Yeah,
talking about things in the news right now. These are things that topics and ideas that you can return to in 5, 10 years from now, and they still will be relevant. So that's what I like about it.
brilliant,
Mm.
brilliant. So this is a bit of a journalistic question, I suppose, but
Sure.
have any aspects of Steve's life sort of rubbed off on you? And by this, I mean maybe when you were younger, sort of his dress sense, or maybe not his choice of car, but fashion choices, that sort of thing. I know for me, I think it was on your podcast. Someone mentioned about him. having a particular brand of Rolex. Is it the
Mm.
Seameister Rolex watch? And I've got a digital watch, so thankfully one of the watch faces that you can put on is the
Yeah.
classic 60s one.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to have that on mine.
Yeah.
That's as much as it's been for me. I could pinch his watch face, but he did have a very distinctive sort of fashion, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. I think it's impossible to watch a McQueen film or watch a series of McQueen films and not have him rub off on you just a little bit. So whether it is those little things, putting a retro face on the digital watch, or getting a pair of the desert boots, or I mean, who hasn't watched The Great Escape and then bought a crew neck sweatshirt and cut the sleeves off it? I mean, who hasn't done that? Everyone's done that, right? I think.
Well, yeah, maybe listen to this show.
I think McQueen, the ways that he may have rubbed off on me will be surprising. I think for me, a bit of a cautionary tale. Steve McQueen is someone who experienced a lot of early childhood trauma, unresolved childhood trauma, which led some issues in his life as an adult. And I think knowing that and knowing the type of issues he faced, I too had experienced early childhood trauma and some issues that I had to work through, go through counseling. I didn't want to be the kind of man who was cheating on my wife or running around with women or having all these types of issues. And you see McQueen and you see the movie star, but then you read about his life and it's, okay, I don't want to end up like that. Yes, Steve McQueen, the movie star, is very, very cool guy. Men want to be him, women want to be with him, but at the same time, he kind of tells you what you shouldn't do with your life as well. And so I think just trying to be a good man, being a good husband, being a good person, that is kind of, like I said, that might be a bit of a surprise, but just kind of a bit of a cautionary tale to get myself right and to get myself straight. But in terms of the fashion and those sort of things, absolutely. I mean, he had a very clean, clean style. Sure, he might have some t-shirts to say Triumph on it and those sort of things, but he wore a lot of, just blue jeans and desert boots and, just sweatshirts and that sort of stuff. Yeah. And I really liked his sense of fashion. I mean, I'm never going to wear a turtleneck with a blazer over top. That's never going to happen. No. It's a good look for him. It's not going to happen for me.
No. You didn't really see him in suits very often, did we?
Thomas Crown.
Even at formal affairs.
Yeah,
but, true, yeah.
But other than that, I mean, in his personal life, he was so busy in the cars and on the bikes. It was a lot of blue jeans and t-shirts and sweatshirts. And I mean, that's a good look, I think. I like that look.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So eventually, even if it takes maybe another 2 or 3 years, you would have covered Steve's entire career. Mm-hmm. Have you even thought about what you might do after that? If, say, the podcast's been running for 5 years, is there someone else lurking behind? Do you think, well, why don't we cover that? Or maybe you could continue the show and maybe just look at aspects of Hollywood from 50s to the 80s or something like that, maybe.
Yeah. So what I need to make clear is that this is a hobby of mine. This is something I do on the side. I'm a teacher full time. I teach junior high. I teach grade 7. I teach English language arts, social studies, and phys ed, and it's a profession I'm absolutely in love with. So that is what I do from Monday to Friday. The podcast happens on the evenings and the weekends. And I have thought about this. What do I want to do after this? Do I want to transition to another movie star? Do I want to look at other aspects of Hollywood? Whatever I do, I still want Marshall Terrill to be a big part of it. And I have talked to Marshall about this before. I would really, I think, enjoy doing a podcast about the 1960s. It's a decade that fascinates me. It's a decade that I was not alive during, but everything I find about the 60s, and I find myself in that decade quite often, there's just so much there to look at, and I want to gain a better understanding of the 1960s. I could see that being a podcast, the 1960s Popcast, maybe we could call it that, or something like looking at pop culture from the 1960s. That is something I've looked at or I've kind of mulled over in my head. That could be a possibility. But like I said, anything I do, I kind of want Marshall to be involved with, and I know he really likes the 70s a lot, and he also likes the 60s. So there could be something there. I enjoy podcasting. I enjoy talking to all different people, and it's like I said, it's been a great learning experience for me. So I'd love to continue with it.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good, and there's so much scope in the 60s and 70s. If you just look at cinema in general, yeah, two fantastic decades for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so if Steve had lived another 20 years, so say he lived till he was 70,
Yeah.
do you think he would have continued being the king of cool?
I always think about this, like what films would he have done? I think
Mm,
he's easy to compare to Paul Newman. Like, what films did Paul Newman do in the
yeah,
70s and 80s? And was Paul Newman still kind of a cool guy then? He was well respected. I mean, obviously, Steve
yeah,
was, I'm a bit biased, but I'll say Steve was always cooler than Paul Newman. Yeah, of course he would be the king of cool. He would still be doing the same things that he was doing. You know, Marshall had mentioned, though, that he suspects that McQueen would have left California, would have left Los Angeles when he was married to Barbara. Move up
yeah,
kind of closer to Montana or Idaho. I believe that's what Marshall said. I always think this, like 1984, The Karate Kid came out. It's got Chad McQueen in it and Pat Johnson in it. Would McQueen have found himself in The Karate Kid? Like I said, his son was in it. His karate instructor, Pat
yeah.
Johnson, was in it. He plays the referee in The Karate Kid. Is that the kind of movies he would have found himself in?
Mm,
Would he have kind of transitioned that way, or would he have stuck doing these strong leading roles? I don't know. It's hard to say, but it's a fun game to play, the what if game.
yeah.
But I do think he would have still been the king of cool. He would have been on the bikes. He would have been in the cars. Yeah, he'd still be the king of cool.
Who knows? Yeah, like you say, comparing him to Paul Newman is a good thing to do. I mean, the last cool film I saw Paul Newman do was The Color of Money, but that was just the sequel to The Hustler, so he was already halfway cool, wasn't he? That one, but he was certainly an older guy. I think he was still fantastic in that one. But yeah, I still think Steve would have done some what would now be considered classics if he'd have lived a bit longer. I'm certainly had those in him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too.
And do you personally have a favorite McQueen movie, or does that change quite a bit?
Yeah, that changes quite a bit off and on. Marshall will get me fired up about a film. Like, I'll come into the
Hmm.
conversation with Marshall about a movie, and then I'll say, I don't know about that one. And then he'll drop some knowledge on it, and I'll go back and watch it again, and I'll go, yeah, actually, Marshall's right. This is pretty good. I will say that if I had to pick, I can't pick one. I pick three. I mean, Bullitt is impossible not to be a
Yeah.
favorite. I love the city of San Francisco. I think it looks incredible in that film. The
Mm.
car,
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
wardrobe. This it's almost like the story. The story is
It's secondary.
yeah,
Yeah.
secondary. Everything else is up
Yeah.
front and center. It's a fun movie to watch. The soundtrack
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yes. Lalo Schifrin, isn't it?
yeah, it
Yeah.
is.
He's one of my favorites. Yeah. Even the title sequence is amazing. There's so much good about Bullet.
Yeah,
Actually. Yeah.
and that's probably the my favorite soundtrack of any McQueen film is the Bullitt soundtrack.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things I love about that film, and so that's a favorite. The Blob is one of my favorites. I there's something about McQueen early in his career, in his early films, that fascinate me and that I'm drawn to. The Great St. Louis Bank Robbery, even though
Hmm.
it doesn't look great, it's not the best film. I enjoy that movie, but yeah, I like The Blob. It's again for all different reasons as well. There's so many components of that film that I enjoy, and it just all comes together, and it's an enjoyable watch. It's a fun watch. And then Hell is for Heroes, just a gritty black and white war film.
Yeah.
McQueen is a savage in it. He's killing people with a butcher knife. That's some Tarantino
Yeah.
level type of stuff right there. And that's a fun movie to
Absolutely.
watch. That's a fun movie to
That
watch.
that was one I'd never seen until listened to your podcast. I only watched it last week, and I thought, cool, that's excellent. Yeah, it's a really good one.
It's overlooked. It's not talked about enough. Hell is for Heroes. Yeah, and that's got a great cast as well. So those would be the three that I enjoy the most.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. Would there be any other sort of podcasts that you might recommend that fans of Speed and Bullet, will just check out this one or that one, sort of similar to what you do?
I don't know if I can suggest one that's comparable to Speeding Bullet, but what I will say is if you're a fan of movies, if you're a fan of films, the New Beverly Cinema, which is Quentin Tarantino's movie theater in Los Angeles, they do a podcast called Pure Cinema Podcast. And it's just two guys, sometimes they're joined by a guest, and they're just talking about deep cuts, movies that might have flown under the radar or people don't know about, movies from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and cult cinema, stuff like that. I have gotten so many great suggestions for films to add to my watch list because of those guys, and they've been great movies. So the Pure Cinema Podcast, again, it's out of Quentin Tarantino's New Beverly Cinema in Los Angeles, and the episodes are like 2 hours long of these two guys just talking about films that they had watched. Sometimes there's a theme to the episode, but that would be my suggestion. If you love films, if you love movies, and lesser known movies, they're not going to be talking about Marvel films or anything like that. It's a great podcast, and Quentin Tarantino's on it every once in a while. And when he's talking about film, that's a treat.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Boy, does he loves his boy does it. No, I've been a huge Tarantino fan since the very, very early days. Yeah, and him and Brian De Palma. I think Brian De Palma influenced Tarantino quite a bit. And but yeah, him and Scorsese, some of my best favorite directors for sure. Oh well, that's fantastic. So in conclusion, then, what is the best way for people to either connect with you and or listen to the show?
It's available on every major podcast platform, iTunes, Spotify, any of those. You can search for it online, Speeding Bullet, The Life and Films of Steve McQueen. You can visit speedingbullet.com, so make sure you spell bullet correctly, though, Bullitt, just like the McQueen film. I'm on Twitter at Steve McQueen Pod. You can check me out on there. And I do pop up on the various Steve McQueen Facebook groups, although not that often. I don't want to spam anyone with the podcast, but I'm easy to find. Speeding Bullet. Definitely check out the podcast if you like Steve McQueen. Check it out. If you like films from the 60s, check it out. I think people would really enjoy it.
Oh, that's brilliant, Kelsy. Thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great talking to you, and it's great to know that I have people who listen to the show all over the world. So that's very cool.
So there you go. I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you have, do please give it the thumbs up. Do please consider subscribing, not just to this channel, but go and subscribe to Kelsey's amazing podcast as well. Links down below. Thank you very much for watching today, and I shall look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye.